Thank you for joining Jacob City Fishing, where the goal is learning to live in the great outdoors found as we walk outside of our homes into nature and society. Colossians 1:15 through 23. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. And you, who once were alienated and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds, he is now reconciled in his body of flesh by his death, in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach before him. If indeed you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you heard, which has been proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and of which I, Paul, became a minister. Not only is Jesus the image of the invisible God, but also the firstborn of all creation. Now, at first, from an Islamic or Muslim, however you want to put it, point of view, they would say that this is referring to Jesus being created, or that God had to have a relationship with Mary in order to create Jesus, but that isn't the case. Even in this text, the supportive information in verse 16 states, "For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him," and it goes on. So if you look at that and understand all things were created by him and through him, whether visible and invisible, on earth or in heaven, throne, any authoritative role, whatever the case may be. And a lot of this text, especially when it brings up this authoritative structures, is pointing to the fact that Jesus is the authority. He's the firstborn. In Jewish culture, that ultimately meant that he received the majority of the inheritance, and he received the role as the tribal chief when the father passed away. Now, obviously, God is not going to die, but it does mean that Jesus, the person of Jesus in the Trinity, is maintaining an authoritative role as that of the firstborn, receiving all of the inheritance that he will, but then also bringing others in, us as meaning us, and it will say that he's the firstborn from the dead, that he rose from the dead, and that ultimately Jesus is the one that we need to submit to. Now, most of the time, we don't like this, right? We think in terms of slavery in the 1800s and think there's no way that I'm going to submit to somebody in that fashion. I'm not a slave to somebody. However, I don't care how personal you take it, before God, we are, by choice, enslaved to God as bond servants, bond slaves, really. That we have chosen to submit ourselves out of the kingdom of this world and the enslavement that comes with it, and into the kingdom of God, in choosing to be a slave of Christ. Either way, we're slaves. Prior to knowing Jesus, we're slaves to sin, slaves to this world. There are constraints on us because of sin. We can either choose to maintain that sinfulness and that life of sin, or submit ourselves to Christ, and he can free us from the bondages of that enslavement and that slave master, and choose to live under a new king. But we have to acknowledge, first and foremost, he is the firstborn. That is the function that a function that he plays. And so you, as a believer, again, especially, the weekend's coming up, you're going to make choices over what you do for fun or for your chores or whatever the case may be. But you have to ask yourself, who is the ruler of your life? Is it Christ? Is he the one that is the firstborn that you look to? Or is it yourself? As we look to this weekend, ask that question of yourself. Are you submitting under the authority and function and kingship and lordship of Christ, and choosing to live in a way that is reflective of that. Thank you for taking a moment to consider what God has to say during your adventure outdoors. Please click the subscribe button below along with the notifications button on the YouTube channel so you learn how to survive and thrive in these great outdoors.